A warm welcome to this webinar on the economic impacts of learning losses at school with Professor Eric Hanuschek, a very prominent economist at Stanford University who has shaped the field of the economics of education like no one else. We have also with us Professor Ludger Wössmann, another of the stars on the scene who directs the Center for the Economics of Education at the German Institute of Economic Research. And they are going to present a fascinating report on the impact of learning losses on our common future. And they will also answer any questions that you have, so just put them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. The reason why the OECD asked them to write this report are actually very straightforward, and you'll be familiar with them. At the height of the crisis, we had 1.5 billion students locked out of their schools. Yes, there was some remote learning, but actually it hasn't addressed many functions of schools, the academic functions in particularly. It has also tended to amplify social inequalities. You know, students who had great support at home, access to good technology, relating well with their teachers. Of course, for them, this was not such a tragedy, but for the many young children who did not have the substitutes, who did not have the level of parental support, no teachers looking after them. For them, this has been a devastating period. We have seen examinations and accreditation being put at stake and teachers struggling to keep up, waking up every day in a new world. If you look at the quantity of this by the end of June, unfortunately, these are the latest data that we have currently on this, you can see that school closures had varied from 7 weeks in Iceland. They were the ones who were quick back on their feet, to 19 weeks in China. So the huge kind of numbers of hours, if you translate this into effective student learning time. Now, although the virus is still present, schools are on the way to get back on their feet, reopening. Meanwhile, we also understood that schools tend not to be the big super spreaders of this virus. If you think about, evidence from previous epidemics that we have suggested, school closures, yes, may, prevent around 15% of infections. What we can achieve through, household quarantine, case isolation, and workplace social distancing is so much more effective. And that has motivated most countries to sort of get schools to reopen, often with lots of constraints, capacity constraints. You cannot have as many students in the class as before, the limits on how students can move, mandatory, application of social distancing protocols limits a lot of things. Common areas in schools are closed. Certain subjects are much more difficult to deal with. Singing and sports are much more difficult to deal with than mathematics and science, and so on. Lots of constraints, but overall, if you look at the data, you can see, many countries are, getting back. Sometimes there are still local school closures at certain areas where the virus is out of control, but more or less, countries are getting back. So now some say, well, you can see the problem is over, schools are reopening, why do we worry that much? Well, the students who lost a lot of learning, that effect is going to be visible for a very, very long time. And that's exactly what you're going to hear through this kind of webinar. Now, I wouldn't also, if we basically say those losses will go away, or if schools couldn't do anything about it, I would have stopped the webinar right here. But actually, I think we have some really interesting data in the moment that shows this. Now, those people who say students are going to catch up, don't worry, this is all going to go away. I just want to show, one slide that highlights, how much progress we saw in the wealthiest countries of this world, the OECD countries, between 2000 and 2018, a time in which, technology has revolutionized every aspect of our lives. But you can see, basically, when you look at learning outcomes, things have pretty much been flat. We have seen almost no progress. The world looked in educational outcomes, looks in 2018 pretty much as it looked in the 2000s. Now, if you would see a line like this on a brain scan, you'd get very worried. And this is basically the phenomenon that we have to struggle with. this is no longer good enough. We need a radical kind of improvement in outcomes. Just one number to this, less than 1 in 10 students on our literacy test of 15-year-olds could distinguish a fact from an opinion as soon as the context got a little bit more complex. You can say, well, it's better than 7% in the year 2000, but we live in a totally different world. Now, once again, if this would be the end of the story, we can't change things. We can't improve things. There would be no point for us to continue this discussion. But, there are always positive exceptions. You look at the Chinese regions that participate in PISA, they are now at the top of the scale. You look at a country like Singapore, moving from good to great, or Estonia, one of the poorest countries in Europe, continuing to see rapid progress. Portugal, the poor cousin of Europe, at a very sort of significant achievement. Poland, moving from below to above the OECD average. You can even look to some, very poor education systems. You look to Peru or Albania. Countries like, Brazil or Turkey may not look as impressive on this chart, but you look at Turkey, they have been more than doubling participation of 15-year-olds in the school system between 2003 and 2008. And it's a good example how you can actually improve quantity and access at the same time as education quality. You take a country even like, Sweden, that saw a long period of decline, but suddenly they caught the ball and turned things around. So it can be done. We can see improvement. This is, I think, why we should look at the losses, but we should also take the courage from the world's most rapidly improving education systems that things can be done. Very last slide. The social disparities is perhaps the part that worries all of us most at this time. The huge number of students who are just left behind, the most disadvantaged or penalized most by these school closures. But let's get back to normal times. Let's take a simple country, like the Slovak Republic. And you can see the gap between the most disadvantaged students and the most privileged one in terms of learning outcomes is huge. It's like the world that you can see in one tiny country. And again, lots of people say, well, it's poorer kids from poorer families. What do you expect? They will come out worse than children from wealthier backgrounds. But once again, you look across countries, you take Portugal, and you can see the 10% most disadvantaged students in Portugal with exactly the same characteristics as those in the Slovak Republic. They come close to the average student in the Slovak Republic. And you can take the 10% most disadvantaged students in the 4 Chinese regions, and they match almost the performance of the wealthiest students in the Slovak Republic. So once again, we should not, take what we see in our school system every day as inevitable. We need to strive to do better. But I don't want to take any more time from the authors of the paper here. They're going to present the findings from the report. And maybe I should just say one thing, why is this so important? I think during this crisis, we all understood, the cost of of school closures in the short term. Students couldn't get at home, they had to work, could get to school, they had to work at home. It was a big burden on families and so on. Parents couldn't get to work when the children were small. This is the kind of short-term school closure cost that we are all aware. And but actually, we pay very little attention to the damage that this does in the long run to individuals, to students, and to economies. Actually, this is almost totally disappeared from public discussion, from policy discussions. Of course, it's intuitive, as a policymaker, you worry about the urgent, you sometimes, put the important further down the track, but I do think that is something that we need to pay attention to. And this is where the work of Professors Hanušek and Westman is so absolutely groundbreaking. They have developed methodologies that project the learning losses in today's schools to what that means to the economic development of our countries in the long run. And their numbers are very, very big. You're going to see this. And you might be react by thinking, well, the numbers are too big to believe. Big numbers are always, but think about it the other way around. Everything that you see around yourself is about people. The material value of the computer in which you do this Zoom call is a few dollars, a few euro. everything else in this computer is about people. It's about the skills of people. That's what our economies are built on. So less knowledge means less productivity, less economic outcome. And you add this up over many years and you just end up with very big numbers. But let me stop here and turn it over to Ulrich.
Thank you very much, Andreas. What you have presented is the absolute correct introduction to all of this discussion, because here in the United States, everything is about the logistics and mechanics of reopening schools, but very little attention to the learning issues that are, in fact, in our opinion, central. And they're central just because of the reasons you mentioned. We're going to provide you with some historical evidence from economies around the world about the importance of skills of individuals, because that is the knowledge capital of nations. That's what nations live upon. So let me give you a very quick introduction, and then Ludger will, in fact, provide some background to how we got to our estimates. And then we'll come back to the points that you raised in your introduction. What can we do? We've seen some countries, in fact, performing better. In fact, there are ideas that exist in the research world that might now have a place for remedying and remediating some of the losses. Let me give you the, here if I can.
Yeah, it's that.
Good, thank you. This is the report that was issued today by the OECD and will be available to anybody who wants it. Let me just briefly give you an introduction and then we'll get into the numbers. We started with the idea that almost around the world, there were universal closures of schools. Andreas gave you some numbers that these varied in different countries, but almost every country had closures that were significant. And we can't assume that these closures were benign. They, in fact, led to significant losses of learning and put students way behind. Now we're trying to get back and just get kids into schools again in many countries. And there are a variety of reopening strategies. We will not discuss any of the reopening strategies. What we're going to discuss is what has been lost already in terms of economic impacts to students and to nations. And we're going to talk a little bit about what would happen even if schools immediately got back to their 2019 levels of performance. We don't know the extent of harm yet because lots depend upon how we get from school closures to an ongoing steady state performance of our schools and what that looks like. In most countries, that's unknown because things are different. Even though kids are back in schools, things are just different. One of the things that's different that we know of is that there's a lot more of in-home learning as opposed to in-school learning. And this almost immediately means that there are going to be large issues of achievement gaps because some parents, as Andreas pointed out, are much better able to adapt to having kids at home and being a more active teacher of their own kids. Other parents are not as prepared to adapt. And in fact, the ability to adapt to in-home learning has been and probably will be in the future highly correlated to the parental background, the education, the income levels of parents, and their ability to, in fact, spend time with their kids. These achievement gaps are going to overlay everything that we have to say here. we're going to provide what I've called the best case estimates of losses. They essentially assume that the world returns to 2019 levels of performance immediately or close to immediately, and that there are no added cohorts of students who are affected by the closures that hit students who were in school in grades 1 to 12 as of early 2020. To give you some idea of the magnitude, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ludger Wussmann, who will describe how we estimate the cost of this, the long-term cost, and what the magnitude of these costs are. Ludger?
Great, thanks. Yes, as Rick has pointed out, really nobody quite knows precisely and perfectly how large the learning losses are. And so we're going to give a range of estimates here based off of different perspectives. But let me just quickly give one piece of evidence on this, because I mean, in most countries they've stopped testing. We don't really quite know like what the losses are. So here in Germany, we did a study where during June we surveyed 1,100 parents of school-age children and asked them, like, how did the kids use their time during the school closures and on a normal school day before the school closures. And then just to give you some idea of the size of the problems here, what we learned is that on average, learning time was cut in half from 7.5 hours per day into 3.5 hours per day. It's like nearly 40% of the children did not spend at most 2 hours per day learning, 3/4 of the kids at most 4 hours. So it's clear that a lot of learning was lost then. And as already indicated, we do see differences by advantaged and disadvantaged children. Actually, kind of interesting. We didn't see big differences between kids from high income, low income parents or high educated, low educated parents in the time they spent on schooling during the closures. The real difference was between high achieving students and low achieving students, say based on their grades before the pandemic. So it's really the low achieving students who are hit hardest by this whole school closures. I think the main reason for that is, and we also asked parents, what did schools do? And only 6% said that their kids had daily online schooling. So only 6%. It's like nearly half of them said their kids never had any online schooling. So this is something that Germany just didn't manage to implement across the schools. Even lower is the numbers of kids who had regular interaction with their teachers. So they were mostly left on their own at home. They got tasks to do on their own at home. And the high achieving students do that reasonably well. They read a textbook and then try to do it. And the low achieving students, they are really lost. And that's, I think, the ones who are hit hardest. And then actually the learning losses can get even bigger than just the lost time, because actually we know that stagnation here actually means moving backwards, because you forget and you education is a dynamic process. So let's see what all of this means in terms of economic outcomes. There's really two types of perspectives, or two related perspectives here. The one is at the individual level. So the students who lose out on learning are likely to earn lower income later on. The second perspective is that as a nation as a whole, our economies can grow as fast with less skilled workforce. Let me start with the first perspective, the individual level. We know a lot about how individual people's skills relate to economic outcomes. There's huge scientific literatures on these. The data we use here, the estimates that we use here, really come from the OECD's PIAC study. So the survey of adult skills that the OECD has done, and with that you have data on the skills of people and their income, and so you can directly see whether and to what extent people with higher skills earn more on the labor market. There's actually a second literature on this, where say 70-year-old students are tested, and then you follow them in the labor market, and 10 years later you look at how much they earn, and actually these two literatures get very similar estimates. So we built on this here because we actually now have data for more than 30 countries that participated in PIAC, And on average, that's kind of the pooled column that you see here. On average, what we see here is that one standard deviation in test scores is related to 23% higher income. That's what's at the top of the column here. So what is a standard deviation? That's how we usually like to measure test scores. Like a general rule of thumb that on average what students learn during one school year is about 1/3 of a standard deviation. It may be somewhat more or less, depends on the context, but if you take that rule of thumb, that really means that like 1/3 of that is about like 8% of additional earnings per year for 1 year worth of learning. And with that, we can then directly go and see how much income will be lost on average. So of course, not for every individual specifically, but on average, for example, for a cohort that loses 1/3 of a year of learning. So that's the one on in the left column, and the one I'm highlighting here with the orange box. And that directly gives you the idea that on average, when looked across all these countries, that would mean an income loss of 2.6% over your entire working life. Or if you like, actually the returns to skills are somewhat higher, for example, in the United States, actually also in Germany is quite similar. There, the third year of loss of learning is equivalent to 3% lost income. There's a bit of a range of these estimates. The lowest, for example, in the PR countries is for Greece, which is still would give you 1.5% lost income, but there's also much higher countries with much higher returns. These are the more dynamic countries like Singapore, where the lost income would then be equivalent to more than 5.5%. And you can basically, so this is for somebody who loses 1/3 year's worth of learning, which I think is probably a good estimate for what has happened so far for many students. If we don't manage to get the kids back to learning, and if this goes on for the same period, say until the end of the year, you just go down this table, and like if it's twice as much lost learning, it's really twice as much lost income in the long run. And again, so these losses will probably be larger for the disadvantaged students who have higher learning losses, as we just discussed. If you go from this individual perspective to the country perspective, to economic growth, well, work that both Rick and I have done, but also several others in the literature, shows that the skills of the population, as measured like the predecessor tests to the PISA test, so International Student Achievement Test in math and science, they show that actually the skills of the population are probably the most important predictor of the long-run economic growth of a country. And from those numbers that we get there, where we learn how are the skills of the population in the country related to the long-run growth rates, we can now use that to project out what happens to the economy if you lose learning. I mean, in the past, we have done projections where we think like, what happens if you manage to improve the quality of your schools? And then you can see how much you gain. Well, no, it's just the other way around. We are going to lose future growth. And the bad thing is, like in our other projections, we usually assumed like it's going to take time for schools to improve. It's going to take 15 years, and then therefore everything takes very long. I mean, here these learning losses were immediate, and so what we here model is a simple and really baseline scenario where the 12 current cohorts, the 12 years of kids in school, lose out, say again, 1/3 of a school year, or you can take the full range here again. But then the schools immediately go back to the 2019 situation. In this scenario, that basically means that like for 12 years, we're going to have like reduced quality people entering the labor force, and then we basically assume these going to stay in the labor force for 40 years. Then they're going to retire, and like after that, we are back to the original growth rate. And then we basically just calculate how the GDP of the economy will evolve under status quo circumstances, and then under the new labor force that is going to be reduced in the skills of the population for these 12 cohorts. And we're going to discount future GDP by 3% per year. And what you get here is that of course, this takes quite long to fully enact. Like for the next few years, the GDP growth rate won't be much affected by this. But in the long run, you see that these numbers are going to be really big because the skills of the population ultimately are the main driver of the economy. And if you do these projections, what you basically get out, this 1/3 of a year of lost learning for the current student cohort at the end of the day will cost 1.5% of the discounted future GDP over the rest of the century. So we basically take this perspective like of over the lifetime of a child born today, 80 years to the end of the century. And on average over that, the GDP will be reduced by 1.5%, which is equivalent to about 70% of a current 1 year's GDP. But this really has like direct numbers for each country. So you can take this to each nation and say what that means. And that's what we see here. So this is going to range, like if you just take this 1/3 of a year's lost learning and discount the whole future lost GDP, this ranges from $500 billion in South Africa to more than 14 trillion in the United States and more than 15 trillion in China. So you can see that at the end of the day, if you take the long run perspective, these learning losses, if we don't manage to ameliorate them, are going to cost us very dear. So with that, I'll give back to Rick with ideas on like, can we do anything against that?
Well, the most important point I think that you made at the end, Ludger, was that just getting schools back to where they were in 2019, which people think is going to be a struggle right away, will not erase these losses. These are essentially permanent losses unless we can, in fact, make up for the lost learning in the future. But just returning to the 2019 schools will not have the effect of making up for lost learning. It will keep us on the same path we were on, but we will end up with this workforce and society that is less skillful as these people go out. The second point is that one that both Ludger and Andreas made is that we're already facing less information on what to do and where our students are. Virtually every country in the world, in the face of the pandemic at the beginning of 2020, stopped all regular testing of students. And so there is a lot of guessing about how far people were moved back or what they had lost. We have given you our best guess that it's essentially equivalent in the past to a third of a year of learning on average. Obviously, there are big differences across countries and within countries, but without information, we're going to be in trouble. And already, for example, in the United States, a variety of people are talking about eliminating all future testing, which will not change the situation for the better. It will make it less difficult to say exactly who is lost and how big the losses are, but we won't be able to use regular information on student performance for any management purposes, which has proved to be a useful device if you look across countries. As Andreas pointed out, this is not inevitable. In fact, we have seen in the PISA data over the last 15 years or so, a number of countries, Poland, Peru, and so forth, that have in fact shown dramatic improvements in the performance of their students. If you look at these countries, they've done it in different ways. And in fact, that will be the future as we look across countries. Each country will try to adapt remedial policies to fit their circumstances. But the things that we would like to point out is that perhaps the reactions of closures and reopening of schools and the magnitude of the earnings losses makes it easier to do some of the things that we already thought we should be doing, but have had trouble, in fact, putting into place. So what we do in the paper is very briefly just highlight a few specific options that, in fact, directly build upon where we're at in most countries with closures and reopening. The first thing that I would point out is that as we go to a lot more at-home instruction, video, internet-based instruction, and some in-class instruction, we know from past experience that some teachers are just much more effective at video instruction and this decentralized instruction model that many countries are going to in reopening, while other teachers are more effective at the in-class use of in-class instruction. So the first option would be, building upon what we've already known, is that if we can use our teaching force more effectively, we can actually improve our schools. So that if we use the teachers that are particularly good at in-home instruction through the internet and so forth, and use them more intensively, while we use the teachers that are better at in-class instruction more intensively, we could in fact come out ahead of where we are today and where we need to be to ameliorate the losses that exist. A second element that comes out of looking at the current circumstances is that we know that students are going to come back to schools with much more variation in where they're at. A fifth grader will not be just a fifth grader. A fifth grader from some backgrounds may even be ahead of where they would have been prior, depending upon the learning that went on when schools were closed. But other fifth graders will be quite a bit behind where they were in the past. What this suggests is something that we also have known from research and experience in the past. If we can be more individualized in the instruction and focus on building upon where students are at each point in time, we can, in fact, make schools better off for everybody. We can no longer just say we're going to teach to an average student in grade 5, but in fact, we are going to provide differentiated instruction, perhaps with different goals for kids in the same class, but build upon where they're at and try to improve things. These are just a couple examples that become immediate ideas that is brought about by the dramatic changes that have occurred in schools around the world. We sketch those out in this report, and I'll turn the program over to Andreas, who has some other thoughts on how schools can improve and build upon what we already know. But the point that I want to leave with, the simple message, is just getting back to where we were in 2019 will harm the current cohort of students and will harm the nations. Getting back to where we were will not be sufficient to, in fact, erase the economic losses that have already accrued. Andreas?
Thanks so much, Rick and Lund, for a fascinating presentation. And we have over 300 participants with us, so you can expect a lot of questions. So my suggestion is to go straight into the questions so that the participants get their answers. Let me just summarize a few. One very specific one is there evidence on which age group would be more affected by the learning loss? So in other words, if we can bring kids back to school, where would you start?
I don't think we have very strong evidence on that, frankly. People haven't focused on that so much because we haven't had any circumstances like this where we immediately stop schooling for people at different ages. I think that's something that we're going to have to learn, and I think that's another example of the tremendous demand for getting immediate information on where students are, on the achievement of students.
Thank you. The question of whether we can equate learning time to learning losses. In a way, the report assumes, learning times is lost, and that's equating to a certain loss of learning outcomes, and that then has economic consequences. How to what extent does that assumption hold? Is another question.
That's actually, it's a very important question. I think that we thought a lot about. There's been this other question that I just saw in the chat. It's like, are learning losses really permanent? Don't you think that providing enough customized support will help children catch up again? And these are things we really had in mind. So I think, of course, if you close schools for a couple of weeks and then get back to normal, I think that won't have real long-term consequences. But by now, we are at these really long times that schools have been closed. Luckily, we don't have past experiences with that. But actually, there's quite like a few different examples of things that people have looked into that are probably not too different. For example, in several countries, we've seen pretty long teacher strikes that close schools or whole schools in whole areas. There's evidence from Belgium on that. There's evidence from Argentina, from Canada that I'm aware of. And several of these studies actually can look at long-run outcomes. And what you see is that the kids who were affected by these school strikes that also went on for several weeks or sometimes even months, they were less likely to have higher education credentials. So they were less likely to go to university and finish high-profile university credentials. And in Argentina, they even showed that the kids that were affected by these school closures due to teacher strikes had significantly lower income as adults. So you can see that, like, as soon as these school closures go on for some time, you can show that these have very long-run outcomes. We've had in the 1960s in Germany, we actually had several states had a couple of short school years where they actually even they planned the whole thing and just they wanted to make sure that all the states have the same summer schedule, and some went on a winter schedule, and so they changed that in the other states by having 2 years that were just a bit shorter. And recent evidence has shown that actually the affected cohorts have lower skills even as they are in their 50s and 60s. We can see that with the PIAC data. And they have significantly lower earnings, actually to the same extent as the returns to schooling, to skills that we've just used in our study here. It gives you the same estimate. It's really amazing. And a third example that many people know about, there's been a big literature in countries like the US and Canada that have these long school summer holidays, like of 2 to 3 months. And then there were many studies who tested kids just before the summer break and just after. And what you see is that the learning really goes down substantially during these times of closed schools. It's just that unless you keep on learning, this is lost. And these studies particularly show that it's the disadvantaged students who lose the most. It's actually kind of interesting. It's even at least not in math. In math, also the high income children lose out quite a bit, but actually in English, they sometimes even, some of them even learn more during the summer because they are supported a lot at home. They read a lot at home. And that's, I think, how we have to start thinking about closed schools. And I'm really skeptical that, first of all, nothing much happened, because what we've seen is that kids just didn't do anything in school. And I'm skeptical that it's going to be easy to just recoup these learning losses. I fear that many of them will be permanent unless we go into some of these dimensions that Rick has just pointed out, and unless we're going to manage the things that Andreas has shown, that some countries actually have managed to really improve the whole school system over time. But for that, you really have to change things.
Thank you, Ludger. Let me just, sorry.
Andreas, can I come back and just to the first question that was also
I just wanted to show one slide to just on Ludger's point. the link between learning time and learning outcomes is actually not so straightforward. Back to the question that was raised, you can see there are huge differences across countries. You look to a country like the United Arab Emirates, where students spend close to 60 hours learning per week, both in school and out of school. And you compare that with Finland on the other end of the spectrum, where learning time is a little bit more than half of this. So you can, and well, United Arab Emirates is a low performing system, Finland is a high performing system. So from this, you might conjecture, well, maybe it's not so important, the volume of learning time, but learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity and the quality of the learning environment. That's exactly what our data show as well. So you can see in a country like Finland, students learn a lot in very little time, whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they learn very little in a lot of time. And for me, this slide actually makes me optimistic that we can actually change productivity in education. I think that is so important. Otherwise, we would say these learning losses are permanent. There's nothing we can do about it. But I think the cross-country comparisons show actually there is an answer to this. And productivity is something that we can change in addition. We can't make up for the learning time, but we can actually change the productivity part of this. And I think that's what we should be looking to. But Rick, you wanted to come into this?
No, I will pick up. I didn't have such a nice slide to respond to, but we, for our work, equated learning losses to time on just as a rule of thumb that we see on average. But it's not that we think that time is the right answer. We think exactly what you just said. It's how you use that time that is really crucial. And in fact, much of the work that Ludger and I and many other researchers have done have to do with differences in effectiveness of schools per unit, the same unit of time. And so that's how we think of the world. And in fact, we think of the labor market as being affected by what people know and their skills, as opposed to the simple answer of adding up how much time do they spend in a school.
Thank you. There's a question to the OECD. Will the OECD consider developing policy advice on how education systems can minimize learning losses for students? And in fact, we do have several papers on this. My colleagues will provide you the links in the chat to our COVID hub, where you find actually lots of ideas and experiences from countries. We also have a website where we share experiences from countries that have managed the crisis really well, by providing substitutes online, sometimes television. Some countries were very quick to actually provide adequate learning environments. But I think Ludger made this point, on average across countries, we have seen about 42% of the learning losses recovered at best. So, with the best intentions, not being at school has its cost. There are other questions. I think the age we did not, find a good answer to.
So let me add one other thing on the age while you're looking at the questions, Andreas. We do know that early learning has big payoffs later in life. So there's been a lot of discussion of preschool, which has obviously been disrupted by the virus in the same way that others have, and that the early grades will in fact have perhaps larger impacts into the future. We just haven't gone through the details of that in a way that would allow us to be very specific. But we know that the learning in the early grades, when you learn the basics of numbers, it has a big impact on how well you do algebra and calculus.
Yep, good point. There's a question whether technology can, mitigate learning losses in the future. I mean, in terms of increasing productivity. I must say, from the OECD work, evidence is very mixed. In fact, technology intensity in classrooms tends to be even negatively related to learning outcomes across and within countries. Now, the COVID period may change this. We may have learned to use technology more effectively, to make learning more adaptive, more personalized, more granular. all those things, but I don't think we should take it at face value. I think time will have to show whether actually technology holds up to its promises. That will be my response, but you may have other reflections on that.
I think I fully agree on that. We like learning in the classroom. It's hard to improve that by using ICT in the classroom. That's what much research shows. In the short run, though, I think so. As is obvious, I think from what we've shown, I think the most important short run reaction is to try to open up schools to all kids as fast as possible, particularly to the young ones, particularly to the disadvantaged ones, to the extent that the pandemic allows, and that we can do that under the necessary health conditions. But then where that's not the case, and that's the other point where ICT then comes in, I think if schools manage to go to video teaching right away, like to reaching all the kids somehow, that must be much better than just sending whatever PDFs with learning assignments home for them to do. I mean, this is what I was talking about, particularly the low achieving students just sit on their own at home. Maybe their parents try to help them a little bit, but then it's just somebody has to explain to them. And this is why teachers are so important. This is why schools are so important. These are the pedagogues who explain it to you and they realize you didn't quite understand it. They explain it a different way and so on. All that is lost if you're not in school. No, if you are at home, I think we really have to try to right away make sure that we've got online teaching where the teachers still interact with the kids every day, which is also motivationally very important. If you as a child knows, oh, there is somebody who actually is going to ask me tomorrow whether I did my little task or whether I didn't it, that makes all the difference. And if you take that away, and that's what most of our countries have done, this is really devastating for the kids. And therefore, I think, at least in this short run view where schools have to be close personally, I think ICT can help a lot if we are fast in using the stuff like we're using here in terms of Zoom to interact with each other.
Yeah, what we find, we have extensive evidence that just providing a computer with the best knowledge that we have and the best programs doesn't really work very well. And we even see that at the university level with people that are trained to be self-motivated in teaching, that it really helps to have the teacher along to provide help on where to go. And it's particularly important if you have disadvantaged kids whose parents are not as prepared to help out and guide students.
Here's an interesting point raised by Canada. Your study really accounts for the learning losses in school, but during the pandemic, we've also seen huge, declines in learning opportunities for adults at the workplace. In a way, your estimates will probably be much bigger if you were to account for that. What's your take on that?
Yes, the answer is that's exactly the case. We looked at a very narrow picture of just the students who were in schools grade 1 to 12 in the early 2020 and assumed that nobody else was affected. Preschoolers weren't affected, adults weren't affected. There would be no new cohorts that are brought into being affected. We just assumed what I call the best case, that schools immediately get back to their old level starting now as they go through reopening. And that's clearly a very strong assumption. That's why just looking at a third of a year loss in our terms is, in my opinion, a really lower bound on the kinds of economic impacts that are going to be felt.
An interesting question raised by Brazil is that I guess in many kind of emerging economies, it's not just Brazil, schools are overloaded with lots of other functions during this pandemic. They have to take over a lot of health-related and social functions. You expect this to have a medium-term impact, when the kind of conditions, the operating conditions of schooling are compromised. That's probably going to be hard to recuperate, even if students are getting back to school.
I think that's what we've seen in all of the reopening discussions, is a variety of problems that people are facing with just the mechanics and the logistics of providing schools. And in that, the learning that goes on has, in a variety of places, been pushed back a little bit further because the immediate concern is the health and safety. These are serious issues. But what we're trying to point out is that as we address the issues of reopening, we have to be concerned about the actual learning that's going on. It's not just getting kids back into something that we call a school.
Here's an interesting point raised. The estimates that you provide are from a general model across countries. Will you study the differential impact the learning losses have had in different countries and how quickly, or even between schools? That is the variability that we see in, which would give us, I guess, very interesting lessons on what can be done in a pandemic like this.
Yeah, well, you always have to wait for a long time to see the real economic outcomes. You know, the kids who are now in school, it will be a long time until they're like in the labor force and until they're really fully in there. So if you can wait 20 years to get these answers, we hope we can have them. The other point though is there's very little testing right now. I mean, most countries that have some sort of testing of skills of what students know haven't done it this year, have postponed or done away with it, and that's really dangerous because that actually not just for us as researchers, it means that actually maybe we'll never be able to tell because we just don't know how big the learning losses were. That's the one thing. The other thing, I mean, it's dangerous and harming for the teachers because they have to know where the kids are. It would be like as a diagnostics, be very important for them to see where the kids are and to focus on getting it from there. And therefore, on that, I'm somewhat skeptical. On the other hand, I agree with what Andreas just indicated, that hopefully we'll be able to do a lot of analysis of what different countries, different schools, different regions have done in terms of reopening, but then also in terms of helping kids. For example, in Germany, some states have done pretty extensive summer programs for disadvantaged students, and others haven't done anything close to that. And maybe in a few years' time, we can see what the differences are for them.
So we have the same situation in the United States, of course, that we have 50 states that are operating quite differently, and we have 14,000 school districts that are operating differently. And we will be able to observe some of this information as long as we can get data on that. But there is such a big pressure to stay away from testing kids because that would just be another burden on the schools. But in fact, that's how we're going to be able to tell what to do in the future and where we have to direct our resources and our energies.
Rick, I couldn't agree more. You know, I think this is actually an area where education seems so different from other fields. You know, in an employment crisis, nobody would cut the labor force survey. You know, that's the moment when you really need it. That's when you need to understand, you know, where the issues are and how you can intervene. And I think in education, we risk to get blinded and then, you know, not even understand how to intervene. One question was, you know, should we change, you know, exam systems during a pandemic? And in fact, I can respond to this. Several countries have done that. Yes, you know, sometimes you may have to substitute, you know, the form of the exams with another form, and some countries even had to rely on, you know, predicted grades for some time with some adjustments. I think there are lots of ways how we can actually bridge, you know, the physical school closures, but not to have any data is like, you know, leaving ourselves, you know, flying blind. And I do think that is a little bit the problem that we face in a fair number of countries. One question, you know, that has come in various forms and shapes up is, you know, obviously we're going to have less effective learning time now and even after the pandemic. It's probably better to teach fewer things at greater depths than lots of things, you know, in very superficial ways. If you had to make choices, you know, for the post-pandemic world, where would you put your effort?
Well, I would personally go to make sure that everybody has the basic skills, and those change obviously with level of grade level and so forth, but that Kids have to know math and reading and science, and you have to build on that. Now, these are tough choices, obviously, because there are debates that were going on before the pandemic about what should be the relative weight given to different parts of the curriculum and what schools do. But I think that because of the importance for future learning, you have to ensure that everybody gets that basic level. That's partly the idea of individualization that I made before also, is that you want to make sure not that on average, all students in grade 5 get to a certain point, but that all students in grade 5 get to what they should know by the end of grade 5.
Ludger, you had a comment on that, or?
Well, I was about to say effectively the same.
Yeah. I think that's perhaps, in this pandemic, governments had a hard time, helping schools and teachers directly. This was very difficult, but I do think most governments, I think, could probably have done a much better job in giving schools better guidance on how to prioritize the curriculum, how to make those kinds of choices. I guess that, many teachers were left struggling with that question, what do I teach today? And I think that's, for me, one of the takeaways of the pandemic, to have a plan of when I have less time, what is really important and how do we sequence learning so that students can, get the most out of this situation.
I mean, it's strange that in the United States, at least, the schools had plans for all kinds of emergencies, from violent people breaking into the schools to earthquakes to fires and so forth. And so they were well prepared, probably better than any institution other than the military, for a disaster that faced them, but they never thought about the pandemic. And they haven't been very quick to pivot and to learn new things that they weren't prepared for. And that's been the challenge, and it sort of reinforces what you were saying, is to the extent that governments can provide more universal information based upon data and research, that's got to help the individual schools and districts.
Yeah, I think this is something we talk a lot about learning for students. And if you think about the learning opportunities for teachers in the digital world, we just published data a couple of days ago showing that just around, half of the teachers have access to digital learning, materials. That's where you can start. Many of the problems, the difficulties that you face with students do not exist for teachers, the access to technology, the knowledge of using it. But even there, I think many education systems still struggling. But hopefully these are messages I think we take away from this pandemic. That for me is also important, that we do proper research and cleanup and not just return to normal, just forgetting about this. I think it is important for us to study what has been done most effectively in what place, and what we could do better in the future. I think we are nearing the time. I just want to give both of you an opportunity to just offer some concluding thoughts. Rick?
Well, my summary is what we've been talking about all along. The future of every nation in the world is dependent upon the quality of their citizens, what they know and the knowledge of their citizens. And that holds for both the individuals and for the countries as a whole. And so we spend a lot of time talking about economic development and how can we help various countries to improve their well-being. And there's no way that we can do it short of providing skills to the workers. In a knowledge-based world, skills are what counts.
Yeah, I would just add that in general, I mean, it's obvious that for a time we really, all of our attention was on safety and health issues, but we really have to get back to the other focus as well, that this is about learning. It's not about being in school, and it's not about being out of school. It's about whether kids have the opportunity to learn or not. And this really doesn't always require like big technology and so on. I mean, if the teachers really think back and say, oh, yeah, I have to make sure that my kids can actually learn. I mean, you can even just phone every student like a couple of times a week to make sure that things are going forward. There are so many things to do. It's just that we have to focus on the fact that it's really about learning, about getting them the skills that they need to be like successful citizens later on in life. And we cannot just stop that because there's a pandemic out there. And I think just getting that into our heads and making sure that it's about learning again is an important focus that we have to take up from now.
Thank you. I just want to thank the two of you for a fascinating report and also for your leadership in this field. You know, perhaps the most important decision that every country, every society needs to take is how to balance the future with the present. And that's, you know, when you see the Chinese regions on top of the PISA scale, well, you know, every parent, every grandparent is going to invest the last time, the last resources in the education of the children, the future of their country. In Europe and I guess the United States, we have already spent the money of our children for our own consumption. Now, I think that's why we are heavily indebted. And I think that trade-off between the present and the future is going to determine where we will end up. And I think you put your finger on this time and again. I really thank you for this. And with that, I also want to thank our participants, particularly those who raised a number of really, really challenging questions. We're going to document them and we will also record this webinar. Thank you very much.